Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind on his dorm and hightailed it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline. But the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that, or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Stuff like that, and a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you, the girl in the white shirt." "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded so nervous because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter? I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. I know I did. "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh, "there are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work." This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember because it really wasn't very scary, at least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey, kid." He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry." I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught in the intro to university classes, then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old and I was young. I could probably outrun the guy, or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older, closer up, the wrinkles were deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. "That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career." "I know," I remember saying. He nodded, as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. "It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually, they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to rape his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small, loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed when in fact he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On the last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been brought. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved as it was given necessary updates like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large, slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it, but then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the second floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was there that the noise was coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just floating. Floating isn't even the right word. It was just coming down the stairs, straight at me. It had no eyes, it had no face, and yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy. Either way, I can recall the words to this very day.
You know what he did to us.
I didn't think. I couldn't. I just ran. I appended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted. It was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sakes, when I realized how far I'd gone. I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was then able to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by, the accusation still ringing fresh in my ears.
You know what he did to us.
And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together, not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellow excerpts. At some point, around the turn of the century, the house had been residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said he built his own home office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom, mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position, with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day.
You know what he did to us.
There was a reason that mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable, but yes, I know what he did to them, and it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest place, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now, I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin, the slump of his shoulders, the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills and my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind, little by little. Until last week, when I moved in with my fiancé, when I took the boxes into the basement despite his warnings of spiders and mold, because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room, and I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know. Growing up, my father always told me I was a follower, not a leader. On an almost daily basis, he would say to me, "Boy, you've got to forge your own path in life, instead of fooling around with those knuckleheads you call friends." He was, of course, correct, but when I was a teenager, that kind of wisdom went in one ear and out the other. In my mind, I was invincible. I knew everything and I could get away with anything. I was wrong. My friends and I fucked with the wrong person. I spent 2 years in a psychiatric facility, and I'm a shell of the person I was before. In high school, I fell in with the wrong group of friends. We were a merry band of burnouts, jocks, and assholes. We all played junior varsity football for our freshman and sophomore years of high school. We clowned around during school, smoked weed before practice, and never saw the field during games. It was no surprise to anyone we didn't make the varsity team our junior year of school. We suddenly found ourselves with too much free time on our hands now that we didn't have to attend football practice for 3 hours each day. We took to hanging around town after school, smoking and sometimes drinking when we could find someone to buy us booze. Tyler, who was definitely the ringleader of our little group, eventually got us into petty theft. He was your typical spoiled rich kid. His parents were always working, never home, so they bought his affection with gifts, gave him whatever he wanted, so, of course, he grows up to become an asshole. This kid, for whatever reason, loved to steal. It was definitely for the thrill of it, since he had daddy's Amex in his wallet and could buy whatever he wanted. On a typical afternoon, we'd go out of school around 2:30 and drive around town smoking and sometimes boozing. We always rode with Tyler in his brand new SUV. I had a shitty Honda Civic that I had bought after a summer of working, while our other two friends, Chris and Ahmed, couldn't afford cars. Tyler would choose a store and give us a laundry list of items to steal. Ahmed would usually be tasked with distracting the clerks while the rest of us made off with whatever we could get our hands on. We'd then sell whatever we got on eBay and split the profit. I could tell that Tyler was getting bored with the petty theft by the time senior year rolled around. He invited us over one weekend, and I could tell he had something planned by the idiotic grin on his face. We smoked weed, ripped shots of tequila, and played video games until around midnight. Tyler said he was bored and decided that we needed to go for a joyride around town. However, once we were in the car, Tyler drove us farther out into the suburbs away from town. He refused to tell us where we were going until we stopped outside a large house. He turned to us, motioning towards the dark house, and said, "Yo, this guy is loaded. My dad told me this guy came into his office the other day and insured $500,000 worth of rare coins." Chris pumped a fist in the air and drunkenly slurred, "Hell yeah, man, screw that guy, let's get paid." Tyler extended his fist to Chris for a pound and said, "That's my boy right here," and then turned to Ahmed and me and said, "What about you two?" Ahmed looked at me and then down at the floor. I don't know, man. Stealing shit from a store is one thing, but breaking into some guy's house is goddamn serious." Tyler's face reddened, and I could tell that he was about to tear into Ahmed. Me, being a spineless shit that hated confrontation, jumped in and said to Ahmed, "Dude, you could buy a sick car for yourself if we get those coins." Tyler regained his composure and said icily, "Y'all need to man up. This guy isn't even home. He's in fucking Europe or some shit right now. Have some faith in me. Have I ever got you guys caught?" Ahmed reluctantly agreed to join in, and we passed around the handle of tequila until we had finished it. Tyler pulled out a black bag and passed out black masks and gloves. "Fucking legit," slurred Chris as he pulled on his mask. Tyler smiled and pulled on his own mask. He said, "Okay, here's the plan. We go around the back and check the windows. If they're locked, then we break the glass and let ourselves in. I looked up this guy's insurance application in my dad's office. He has no security system, so we have nothing to worry about." We exited the SUV and crept around towards the back of the house. The windows were all locked, so Tyler picked up a rock and smashed a hole in the nearest window. We boosted Chris in first, and Tyler told him to scope the place out. "Looks empty," Chris drunkenly yelled out. The three of us standing outside flinched, and Tyler muttered to himself, "Goddamn lightweight." When we were all inside the house, Tyler instructed us to split up and search the first floor. I was searching through a cabinet when I heard Tyler yell at Chris, "Put the speaker system down, we came here for the coins." After 10 minutes, we regrouped and decided to split up. Chris and Ahmed would search upstairs while Tyler and I checked out the basement. The basement door had a thick padlock on it, but Tyler laughed and said, "Why put a padlock on a cheap wooden door? What an idiot." He easily kicked in the door. There was no light switch near the door, so we descended the stairs using the glow from our phones to guide us. A small hallway at the bottom of the staircase led to another door. This door was made of steel. Tyler immediately started kicking the door. He gave up after the third kick and began ramming his shoulder against the door. He slumped to the floor, cursing, after his second attempt at smashing in the door. I was about to suggest to Tyler that we admit defeat and go back upstairs. Maybe we could find something else of value. I stepped forward to jiggle the door handle and found that the door was unlocked. Tyler shot me a dirty look from the floor and said, "Why the hell didn't you tell me it was unlocked?" He pushed past me and through the door. We found ourselves in a small room crowded with trophy cases and paintings on the wall. Tyler stepped closer to one of the trophy cases and found it full of rare coins on display. "Jackpot," he whispered. He opened up the case and began stuffing the coins into his bag. I began looking around the room, guided by the light of my phone, and became increasingly disturbed by what I saw. On the wall were paintings of torture from various time periods spanning the last 1,000 years. One painting showed a young boy being lowered headfirst into what looked like a boiling vat of oil. Another painting depicted a woman being burnt alive above a fire, skewered like a pig. Tyler?" I said, my heart pounding. "Shut up and make yourself useful," he snapped. "Check out the other trophy cases." I crept towards the nearest trophy case and aimed the light on my phone towards it. It was full of pictures, dozens of pictures of young men tied up. Some seemed more alive than others. They were missing limbs, tied down to tables, or hung up on the wall. I slowly turned towards Tyler and opened my mouth but found myself unable to speak. I stared at him stupidly, my head pounding and stomach knotted. Footsteps on the staircase freed me from my terrified trance. "Tyler, we need to get out of here right now," I croaked. He said, "What's the rush?" then called out towards the staircase. "Ahmed, Chris, took you clowns long enough. Hit gold down here, boys. Let's spark up a spliff to sell it." The overhead light snapped on, and Tyler and I were momentarily blinded. I started to curse when I heard quiet sobs. I opened my eyes and saw a large, overweight man standing behind Ahmed and Chris. Chris's face was covered in blood, and I saw that he no longer had eyes. Dark, empty sockets looked out upon the room. Tyler straightened up and screamed, "Who the fuck are you? Step back or I'll fuck you up." The fat man pushed Ahmed towards us, put his hand around Chris's shoulder and said,
Chris, why don't you tell your young friend here what happens to boys who disrespect me?
Chris opened his mouth and made a strange gargling sound. Blood dripped out of his mouth. Ahmed, tears running down his face, whispered to us, "He cut out Chris's tongue and eyes." The fat man, eyes glinting, laughed deeply and said,
Ahmed is correct, but I think we can all agree that Chris is much better behaved now.
He patted Chris on the head, tousled his hair, and said,
Which one of you can explain what nice young men like yourselves are doing in my home at this time of night?
Tyler took a step towards the man, raising his fists, and said, "You have no idea who you're messing with." The fat man chuckled, causing his jowls to jiggle, and raised a pistol. Tyler paused for a moment, contemplating the gun in the man's hands. "No way. You can't touch me. My father's a powerful man." The fat man laughed again, put the gun to the back of Chris's head, and pulled the trigger. Brains and bits of skull showered Tyler.
You boys can call me Mr. G, and you're going to do exactly what I say.
He nodded towards me and said,
You, take the painting behind you and twist the knob.
I did as he instructed, and a secret door in the wall opened, revealing a large circular room behind it.
Move along now,
said the man cheerfully. The three of us slowly moved into the room with the fat man not far behind us. In the center stood a stainless steel surgical table. The periphery of the room was filled with a variety of torture devices that looked straight out of the Dark Ages. I recognized the torture rack, Judas cradle, an Iron Maiden, and a large vat sitting over a propane burner. On a wooden table, there appeared to be a wide variety of knives, hammers, scalpels, and saws. Mr. G put his left hand into his pocket and pulled out a black plastic comb. He combed back his dark, greasy hair while still pointing the gun at Tyler.
"Where do we go from here?"
He mused aloud as he placed the comb back into his pocket. He continued,
"Tyler, only one of you will be allowed to leave my house tonight. Who should it be?"
A dark spot began to grow on Tyler's crotch. The smell of urine filled the large room. Tyler pointed a trembling hand towards Ahmed and me and said with a quavering voice, "This was all their idea. They dragged me into this thing, I swear." Mr. G's brow furrowed as if he were seriously considering Tyler's words. He smiled at Tyler and said,
"I believe you, Tyler, but the only way you can leave is if you help me tie up your friends. There's some rope over on the wooden table."
A look of relief came upon Tyler's face, and he smiled at Ahmed and me. He shouted out, "Whatever you say, Mr. G," as he quickly scampered over to the table to retrieve the rope.
"Good. Now bring it back to me, boy."
He turned to Ahmed and me and winked. Tyler approached Mr. G, rope in hand, and said, "You know, Mr. G, I told these guys not to mess with a man such as yourself, but they just wouldn't listen."
Yes, I'm sure you did,"
said Mr. G as he pulled out a small taser and knocked Tyler unconscious. Mr. G grunted,
"You boys stay right where you are,"
as he bent over to tie up Tyler's hands and feet. He then dragged Tyler's limp body over towards the large vat and hoisted Tyler into it. He tied Tyler's hand to a hook hanging over the vat so that Tyler's head would not slip underwater. He then leaned down to light the propane burner under the vat and said,
"Let's get this soup cooking,"
more to himself than to Ahmed and me. Mr. G came back to Ahmed and I and said,
"Who's next?"
Ahmed and I looked at one another, but said nothing. Tyler had awoken on the other side of the room and began begging for Mr. G to let him go. Please, I'll do anything. Oh God, it's getting hot. It's burning." Mr. G ignored the pleas and hummed to himself while staring at Ahmed and me. Tyler's pleas became shriller until they turned to gibberish and eventually one continuous scream, which lasted for minutes. The screams eventually stopped, and the smell of cooked flesh filled the room. Mr. G returned to the vat and turned off the propane burner. Without warning, Ahmed sprang to his feet and sprinted towards the door. Mr. G cursed and fumbled for his gun, aimed and fired off a shot which hit Ahmed in his calf. Ahmed crumpled into a ball on the floor. He only made it halfway to the door. Mr. G walked over to Ahmed, grabbed both of his arms, and dragged him towards the steel table in the center of the room. He looked at me and said,
"Lucky man, I'm going to put on a show for you."
They were 10 feet away from the table when I made my move. I used every last bit of energy I could muster as I sprinted towards the monster in the middle of the room. He had dropped Ahmed's arms and pulled out his gun. I could feel the bullets whizzing over my head, but the adrenaline surging through my body drowned out any and all sounds. My shoulders connected with the man's abdomen, and I pumped my legs, driving him backwards like we were taught during football. We gained momentum as his obese body began to topple backwards. I dug deep to pull up whatever strength I had left. His body slammed into the open Iron Maiden. I released him and immediately grabbed the door and struggled to push it shut. I heard a gasp from within the contraption as the spikes bit into his flesh, but he did not scream. Instead, he began to laugh, louder and harder, until the doors were finally shut and the spikes fully impaled his body. And then, there was silence. I turned and retrieved Ahmed. Supporting his weight against my shoulder, Ahmed and I slowly made our way out of the basement and called the police. The police found a dozen more bodies in the freezer behind the torture room. I was a nervous wreck for years after this incident. Only the intensive therapy have I been able to obtain something resembling a normal life. The deaths of my friends were awful, of course, but the sound of Mr. G laughing during his final moments of life are what haunt me to this day. When I close my eyes to sleep at night, all I see are his eyes twinkling and jowls jiggling as he laughs at the terrible death closing in upon him. On a rainy night, in the era before cell phones, I was 18, walking a very long way home from work, and I foolishly accepted a ride home from a strange man. He was elderly, acted genuinely concerned for me, and I saw a Bible in the back seat. Probably safe, right? The car was old and broken down, and he had to get out to open the door for me. It took him a while as he had trouble walking with a bum leg. He told me the passenger door didn't open from the side. I immediately felt weird, but years of nice girl training told me he's gone to so much trouble. Don't say no. We chatted for a while and he politely complimented my uniform, my hair, and told me I looked like his late wife, and that her spirit must have led him to help me get home. It sounded very sweet the way he told it. The conversation turned to if I was still in school, what my hobbies were like, and gradually turned to whether or not I was on my period. Which was rude, but he acted like it was going to be a punchline of a joke, so I laughingly asked him why he wanted to know. He said very calmly,
"Because if you're fertile, we should start trying for a family right away."
He said that God had kept him lonely for years, but now, because I looked so much like his late wife, it was clear I was meant to be his, so he could start life over again and finally have lots of children like his wife was unable to do. He grabbed my hand and kissed it and said,
"I can't wait to show you our new bed."
I told him I forgot something at work. He told me I could get it tomorrow. I told him I needed to pee, and he said I could hold on until we got home. He wasn't going to let me out. He kept talking about how things were different back then, and how men are the head of the household, that women are to follow their fathers and then their husbands, and God says this and God says that. He talked about his wedding day, how his wife's father had given her to him. So I blurted out, "You're going to need my father's permission to marry me before taking me to your home, right? God would want that, right? You need to do that because otherwise we would be living in sin, and the marriage bed is not holy." He got offended then and said he knew the Bible better than I did, and of course he knew to ask my father for permission. I told him that we couldn't live together in sin and we should go to my house before going home, and I reminded him that the street wasn't far. Still trying to keep the conversation light and joking, I told him that's what a godly man would do, and he wholeheartedly agreed. Then we got to the street where I had previously told him I lived. He asked which house was my parents'. I gave him a fake house number far away from mine and had him drop me there. He wanted to come inside. I told him I needed to let my parents know about God sending me a husband before he could meet them. I said it would take a few days, come back tomorrow. He said,
"I'll give you a few minutes, but then we need to be on our way."
I told him to drive around the block so I could have time to pack my clothes. He nodded and finally opened the car door. I ran to the house's door, waved to him until he drove away, then sprinted to my house, where I lived, alone. Double bolted my door and put the couch in front of it that night. Never saw him again. I didn't call the police though, I wish I had. I moved in with my boyfriend a few days later, and I insisted on waiting at work until he could pick me up every night. Around March of 2014, I started talking to this girl on Tinder. She seemed cool and fun, and after about a week of talking, she suggested we meet up in person. She invited me to this coffee shop and I accepted. However, the day of, she started messaging me saying she had to tell me something. Her pictures on Tinder weren't actually of her, and yes, she was a guy. He claimed he really liked talking to me though and begged me to still meet up with him. Naturally, I declined. I blocked his profile and continued on with life. About a week later, I started talking to another girl. Once again, she seemed cool and fun and we hit it off. She asked me if I spoke to people on Tinder frequently, and rather stupidly I told her about my previous encounter with the man lady. Weeks later, I would realize that this new girl was the same girl as the week before. She asked me if I wanted to meet up and I said sure, as long as it was in a public place. We decided on a cafe and the next day, I sat at the table, waiting. 5, 10, 15 minutes had passed and she was nowhere to be found. I then peered out the window and saw, from across the street, a man staring at me intently. I looked away, waited a few seconds, and looked back. He was still standing there, staring. At this point, I left the cafe, got on my bike, and booked it home. I was definitely a little freaked out, but tried to pull myself together and reasoned that no one could have followed me. I then deleted my Tinder profile, and things were normal for a few weeks. About 3 weeks later, I started getting phone calls. The numbers all showed up as unknown. I picked up the first few times to some guy breathing heavily into the phone. I was already a little freaked out. After about a day, I stopped picking up any call unless it displayed the caller's name. I then started receiving text messages. At first, they were pretty harmless, calls for attention and begging me to meet in person. It then changed to very sexual texts, until eventually the messages became threatening and whoever was messaging me started throwing out my family and friends' names and whereabouts, saying they would get them involved unless I answered. Because they were texting me, I could see a displayed number, but when I called the phone providers, they told me the number couldn't be traced and that it was probably a track phone. Great. I waited about 2 weeks, not responding to the texts, thinking I shouldn't feed the troll, but eventually it became too much. I started getting upwards of 50 texts and phone calls a day. I would wake up to 10 to 20 texts every morning. I then decided to change my number altogether. The texting and calls stopped for a while, but sure enough, it started happening again. I called my phone provider asking if they ever gave out numbers at a user's request, and they said their policy stated that they wouldn't and couldn't unless valid identification was provided. Then one day, I tried logging into my Facebook but was denied. Within a day, friends started to contact me asking what the hell I was doing, saying that they were getting really terrible messages from my account. In particular, one of my girlfriends was receiving messages about her mom who died years ago. I contacted Facebook and explained the situation. They helped me gain access to my account again, at which point I deactivated it for a while. Enough was enough. I decided to contact the FBI, explaining what had been going on for over a month now. They documented everything but told me since I, or any of my relatives and friends, were in no immediate danger, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything. At that point, I felt stuck. I thought about hiring a private investigator or a hacker. I decided against it, however, and just hoped it would fade out if I never answered. I left my Facebook deactivated and ignored any texts and phone calls. I never had any trouble at home, but some of my closest friends received the occasional text as well, which weirded us all out. I hated that they got dragged into it. One day I came home, and things felt very eerie. Door unlocked, windows open, and no one home. A strong breeze running through the apartment. I did a check of the place and found nothing else weird, so I locked everything up and just waited for my roommates to get home. It's been almost 7 months now. The calls and texts have more or less stopped. I'll get an occasional text, but at most one every 2 weeks. At the peak of it, I was receiving almost 100 texts a day. It definitely affected my social and personal life. I became much more weary of the people around me and my surroundings. I just felt like I couldn't really focus on anything until it stopped. Work was difficult, though I tried to maintain my composure as best I could. Everything was just weird. Life was weird. I've since stopped using all forms of dating apps and websites. Things are getting back to normal, and at this point, I just want to put it all behind me. I'm moving at the end of this year, so it'll be nice to have a fresh start in a new place. I'm not going to sit here and say all dating apps are dangerous and no one should use them, but definitely cover your bases. Ask more questions before meeting someone. FaceTime them first, Skype, anything. I was naive about it and I regret it. Be safe, stick close to your friends, and try meeting people in more traditional ways. Weird Tinder stalker? Let's not meet. My name is Andrew Eriks. I lived once in a city called New York. My mother is Terry Eriks. She's in the phone book. If you know the city and you read this, find her. Don't show her this, but tell her I love her and that I'm trying to come home. It all started when I decided around the time that I turned 25 that it was time for me to give up taking my backpack into work. It would make me look more mature, I thought, if I weren't lugging around a book bag everywhere like a high school student. Of course, this meant that I had to give up reading in the subway in the mornings and afternoons since I couldn't quite fit my paperbacks into my pocket. A briefcase would have been out of the line since I was working in a factory, and messenger bags always seemed a little, fruity to me. Too purse-like for my liking. I had an MP3 player which helped pass the time for a while, but when it broke, it would shut down at the end of every song if I didn't skip to the next track manually. I gave that up too. So, every morning I'd sit in the metro for half an hour that dragged on endlessly with nothing at all to do but watch my fellow passengers. I was slightly shy, so I didn't like to be caught at it, so I'd surreptitiously watch people. Interestingly enough, I quickly discovered that I wasn't the only person in the world who was uncomfortable in public. People covered it up in various ways, but I learned to see through them. I divided them up into categories in my head. There were the fidgeters who couldn't get comfortable, constantly moving their hands, shifting their weight, moving their legs closer to the bench, then further. They were the most noticeably nervous types. After them were the fake sleepers who'd take their seat and practically close their eyes in the same second. Most of them weren't really sleeping though. The real sleepers shifted more, came awake suddenly at stops or after loud noises. The fakes just zoned from the second they sat until the moment the train pulled into their stop. Then there were the MP3 player addicts, the occasional laptop people, and the people who traveled in groups and talked too loudly. The cell phone junkies were either very popular or just completely unable to shut up for more than 2 minutes at a time. Just as people watching was threatening to get unbearably boring, I found my first incongruity. A middle-aged looking man, brown-haired, average size and weight, and dressed casually. Oddly enough, he seemed almost too normal. He had no remarkable features, no mannerisms, as if he were designed to fade into a crowd. It was that which led me to notice him. I was intentionally trying to see how people acted on the subway, and he didn't act at all. Didn't even react either. It was like seeing someone sitting in front of the television, watching a documentary about fish. They aren't excited, aren't engaged, but they aren't looking away either. Present, but not accounted for. He was on the subway in the afternoons. It was more than a month into the people-watching experiment before he caught my eye, because I didn't catch the same subway every day and didn't consciously sit in the same car when I did. I saw him for the first time on a Monday, I believe, and for the second time on the Thursday of the same week. He obviously did catch the same train and sat in the same car, in the same seat even. OCD much? I thought at the time. Since he'd caught my attention so much the first time, I watched him more avidly the next. He was, frankly, downright unsettling. He didn't do anything at all. He sat there, expressionless, head straight, no matter what happened. A woman with a wailing child entered the car and sat right behind him, and still nothing. He didn't even so much as turn his head or frown in annoyance, and that kid was fucking loud too. By the time the subway reached my stop, I found myself queasy, and when I exited the car, my hands were shaking like I was having a nicotine fit. Something about that man was wrong, I thought. He was, I thought, some kind of freak. A sociopath, maybe. One of those quiet guys who, it turns out, has a dozen women's heads in the freezer. The first victim, his mother. I found myself intentionally dawdling after work in the afternoons, stopping to browse in kiosks in the mall near the subway, even when I didn't intend on buying anything. For a couple of weeks, I avoided catching the subway, and when I found myself at the stop when it was pulling in, I made sure to choose a train car as far from the one I'd seen him in as possible. Then, one morning, I saw another person who set off the same warning bells in my head. A woman, just as plain looking, just as out of place in the hustle and commotion around her. The moment I recognized her was when my obsession began. My people watching, which had begun as a bit of a hobby to stave off boredom, became something of a religion to me. I couldn't enter a subway or ride a bus without finding myself examining everyone, filling out a mental checklist in my head. Plain clothes of solid colors, no brands, check. No expressions, no casual glances out the windows or towards other passengers, check. No bags, purses, or accessories, check, check, check. We've got another. I started calling them the strangers. I didn't see them every day, even after I started taking the metro more than I needed to, even when I found myself riding buses out of my way in the evenings. But they were there, often enough. Seeing one would set my teeth on edge, make my palms sweaty and my throat feel dry. If you've ever given a speech, you might recognize the feeling. Even though they didn't pay me the slightest bit of attention, I felt like I was on display for them. I could see them plain as day. How could they miss me? They didn't, though, not in any way that I could tell. And when, eventually, my curiosity overpowered my fear, I decided to follow one. I chose the one that I'd found first, the man in the afternoon subway who always kept the same seat. I got on and took a seat behind him. We rode to the end of the line, and he rose and walked out before I did. Keeping distance between us, I tailed him, but he didn't go far. He took a seat on a nearby bench, as expressionless as always, and I turned a corner and waited, trying to look nonchalant. After a few minutes, the next metro arrived, and I watched him enter it, and saw him take the same seat. I couldn't find the nerve to follow him again. He hadn't gone anywhere. He just rode the metro to the end of the line, and then what? Rode it back? What possible reason would anyone have for that? It nagged at me, long after I'd rode a later train back home and tried to get some rest. I couldn't leave it alone, not until I could make sense of it. I found myself more than confused. I was downright angry now. Why was this uncanny bastard, this inhuman person, riding subway trains back and forth going nowhere? The mind, I once read, recoils from certain things because the very sight of them is an affront. Spiders set it off in a lot of people, particularly the great big ones. They just look wrong to us, alien. That was the effect the strangers were beginning to have on me. They offended my senses. I followed him again the next day, and again the day after that. Every day, for at least a week, the two of us made our silent trips together, though only I knew it. By the end of the week, I was following him for hours, until the last train that stopped near my apartment block that night. We rode from one end of the city to the other, then back again. I wasn't people watching any longer. I was person watching. Stranger watching. I didn't have eyes for anyone else, though peripherally I noticed more than a few confused glances sent my way. Other than that, we two might have been the only two people on the planet for all I cared. I lost my job the next week. My manager was kind and timid, but firm. I wasn't concentrating, I had no focus, wasn't being anywhere near productive. It was actually quite a speech, I think, but I could barely hear it. All I could think about was my new work, my vigil. What would that thing on the subway get up to when I wasn't there to keep an eye on him? I left work for the very last time on noon that day. Normally, I'd have started telling my subject at 5:30, but I was sure that he'd be waiting for me. I wish, now, that I'd paid more attention to that day. Was it sunny? It was summer after all. I could have walked downtown, maybe checked out a few pretty girls, could have had an iced cappuccino and smoke at an outdoor cafe and then gone home, put my growing obsession out of my head, found a new job and taken to reading on trains and buses again. Instead, I waited. More than one train goes up and down the lines, so I sat in the station for at least an hour until I saw him through a window. I walked into the subway car and noticed that for the first time, my skin wasn't clammy, my hands weren't shaking, my heart wasn't pounding hard. I sat, for the first time, right across from him, directly in his line of sight. I watched for a change in his face. Would he recognize me? If he did, I saw no sign of it, and I was looking hard. We must have made quite a pair, sitting across from one another that afternoon, staring at and into one another. It was hard not letting the rage building in me contort my face, but with effort I was able to keep as still and as expressionless as him. Inside, I practically screamed at him. "React to me, you fucking asshole. See me, damn it. I know you for what you are." I didn't, though, and my silent demands weren't answered. Not the first trip around, or the second, or the third, or 10th. We rode far into the night together, and at each terminus we got out together and waited. I sat right beside him on the bench, watching him from the corner of my eye, and still got nothing from him. But two could play at that game as well as one. Finally, we made our last trip together. I had him, and I knew it. Last trip of the night, before the trains stopped running. I'd always let him get away from me at that point, because the end of the line is a long way from home, and the buses stop running at the same time as the subways. But this time, I'd follow him, finally see what he was when the trains stopped running. I'd get some answers, maybe. The subway rolled on, and the anticipation grew in me. The car emptied out around us slowly, until it was just we two silent watchers below the city. I fought to keep a manic grin at bay, and the subway train slowed to a crawl, then stopped. The end of the line. The stranger didn't move, still didn't react at all. The car stood still, doors open. I could dimly hear the last few stragglers making their way out of the station somewhere behind us. Footsteps echoing in silence. Nothing. The speaker system dinged to let anyone half asleep know that we'd reached the terminus. Still, nothing. And finally, I could hear footsteps again. A conductor or something popping his head into each car to make sure it was empty before taking the train wherever the hell it goes for the night. I didn't take my eyes from my silent quarry. I managed to see the conductor from the corner of my eye when he finally reached our car. He looked in, his eyes roamed over us, and a puzzled look came over his face. I managed to see the conductor from the corner of my eye when he finally reached our car. He looked in, his eyes roamed over us, and a puzzled look came over his face. He blinked a few times and paused. I waited for him to speak, and the moment stretched out, but then, with a slight shake of the head, he left us. There was a car ahead of ours. and I heard him stop to check that too. And then a few minutes later, the train started up again. We rode for a time and then looped around, and the subway was parked. I could see into and the windows of more trains on either side of us, and through their opposing windows into even more. And then he smiled at me. It was just a small curl of the lip that would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't spent the last several hours studying his face.
"So,"
he said in a rough baritone,
"here we are."
I tried to respond but couldn't right away. My throat had clamped shut. Terror filled me. It felt like the whole underground cavern we were in had just collapsed onto me. I coughed and stammered and finally managed, with a raspy voice, to ask the question that had kept me up at night, drove me halfway to madness, and led me to this place and this moment. What are you? He ignored me. He stood and the train doors opened. Then, shockingly, he turned to face me.
"Coming."
He didn't wait for an answer, but walked out onto the platform. I scrambled to follow. "Come on, damn it," I shouted. "Talk to me. Who are you? Why do you ride the metro all fucking day?" He didn't look back or slow his step. I couldn't see his face, but it's safe to guess that he didn't react at all, no more than he had to anything else. I stalked after him, still shouting for a time, but eventually gave up. 5 words was all I was going to get out of him, I guessed. We walked along the platform until we came to a junction, then turned. Now we were perpendicular to the trains around us. The path ahead was lit from above, but I couldn't see where it ended. The trains on either side of us went on forever, as far as I could tell. Far too many trains service one city, I realized. It wouldn't have mattered by then, I figured, but I probably should have paid more attention to that at the time. I'm not sure how long we walked. I had a watch once, but it broke. I took out my cell phone at one point, but got no reception down there, and all it would show me was no signal. The stranger would stop every now and then, and looked at a subway car for a minute or two, but then pass on. It took me a while to figure out why, but eventually, I saw that they weren't all the same. Long lines of them would be similar, and then we'd come to a different model. It'd be a little larger or smaller, or have a slightly different shape. The cockpits, or whatever you call the front part where the conductor sits, were superficially different as well. I didn't and don't know what exactly he was looking for, but eventually he must have found it, because we turned again, and the subway doors opened when my impromptu guide stopped in front of them. We entered and took our seats. "Are you willing to speak now?" I asked him. No answer. I sighed with frustration and seriously weighed the pros and cons of punching him right in the face for a time, when suddenly, the light in the car came on, and I heard the engine starting up. What the fuck? He gave me a look that was almost sad.
"You're not gonna be able to go back."
"What are you talking about? Go back where?" Nothing, again. This stonewalling asshole. The train lurched into motion, pushing off in the opposite direction than the one we came from. I think. The endless parade of them had thrown off my sense of direction. It rolled for a few minutes and then began to slow as we approached the stop. His vacant gaze grew sharper, and for the first time, I got the sense that he was actually staring at me, rather than just looking in the direction I happened to be in. "Be still. Be silent. Don't catch their attention." The train stopped, the doors opened, and they began to flood in. I don't know what I noticed first. The weird clothes, the 2 long arms with hands that almost brushed the floor, the jet black eyes and angular faces, or the blue-gray hue of their skin. My eyes took in all those stimuli, but for a long second, my brain refused to process it, and when it finally did, I was barely able to bite down on the shriek that tried to tear its way from my throat. I thought my heart was going to explode. Hell, I thought I was going to explode. I was like a strummed guitar string. Everything in me lurched and throbbed. My sight grew dizzy, which I was thankful for, and I vomited. My mouth was clenched shut, and I forced myself to swallow it, barely managing. My instincts were screaming his words at me. Be still. Be silent. Don't catch their attention. That day is a blur. We rode the subway car up and down the line, still and expressionless, for hours, for days perhaps. It seemed much longer than the line I knew, the line I'd followed the stranger along. The hideous things around us seemed to pay us no undue attention, though we must have stood out fiercely. I was so petrified with fear that when we finally returned to the endless cavern of trains, alone, I burst into tears. I collapsed to the floor and just sobbed for a long time, the stranger watching impassively. When I gained control of myself, I looked up at him imploringly. "Take me home," I croaked. "Please."
"I can't,"
he told me.
"Don't know which one of these would lead you back, if any of them do."
He stood and walked out onto the platform, and I rose wearily and followed him. He spun around, sharply.
"I think you followed me enough."
The rage I'd felt for him before that panic had temporarily buried rose up in me. "What?" I screamed, rushing forward. I grabbed him by the shoulder and with a burst of insane strength I didn't even know was in me, slammed him against the side of the metro car. "You fucking son of a bitch. What the fuck did you do to me?" I slammed him again and again. "Take me back." He bore it all passively, and soon the flare of anger in me gutted out, leaving me hollow. "Please," I begged. "Please, take me home."
"That's not how it works. If we stay together, it's more likely that we'll be noticed. Go your own way. Be still and be subtle, and they'll think that you're one of theirs."
"How could you do this to me? Why?" He gave me another, almost sad look.
"I had to. You will too. You get stuck sometimes."
He brushed my hands off his shoulder and turned to walk away. I fell to my knees, suddenly out of strength, and watched him leave. At the junction, he turned back to face me.
"I'm sorry."
And then he was gone. I stayed there on the cold tiles for a very long time. I curled up into a ball and wept for a while. After there weren't any tears left in me, I even managed to get some sleep. When I awoke, the subway train I'd come in on was gone, off carrying more blue-gray abominations to wherever blue-gray abominations go. I couldn't handle going back there anyway. I tried to find my way back to where I'd started, to find a subway that I recognized, but I wasn't even sure which direction I should have been going in anymore. I walked for an hour, then another. Finally, I found one that might have looked familiar, or I was desperate enough to imagine that it did. When I stepped up to the door, it opened for me, and I took a seat. It started up, and in spite of being a lifelong agnostic, I prayed my heart out. The train slowed to a stop, the doors opened, and for a second, I thought I was saved. People, human beings, I'd be the most devout man in the world. Then I noticed the eyes, specifically, the third large eye in the center of their foreheads. Well, fuck you then, God, I thought. They were easier to take on than the last bunch, though, and I was thankful for that. The third eye blinked independently of the other two, though, and that was nauseating, and when one of them smiled or laughed or spoke with another, I couldn't help but notice that their teeth were sharp and misshapen and yellow-green with filth. But if I was careful and selectively blind, I could pretend for a stretch that I was home. Until one of them entered with a sandwich in hand, and I realized with a start that I was starving and I hadn't eaten or drank in what must have been days. The next terminus I came to, I decided to try and find something to eat or drink. I don't know why I waited, but it seemed important to ride to the end of the line. I got there and could barely bring myself to leave. I've never seen the stranger leave the underground. I'd never seen him eat or drink anything either. But my stomach would not take no for an answer. I steeled myself and tried to keep my face carefully neutral and made my way out into the station proper. And then I got confused. I was looking for escalators or stairs or something like that, but all I saw were holes in the ground, the walls, and the ceiling. Gaping, irregularly sized holes, like I was in the middle of a beehive. What was I supposed to do, leap into one? It didn't make any sense to me, not until someone came through one. He floated up through the wall and then floated by me. He frowned for a second, or at least I think it was probably a frown. But apparently, whatever kept them from recognizing me as alien in the subway extended at least this far. It did not, unfortunately, allow me to levitate, which seemed to be the only way out of this subway station beehive thing. Swearing, I made my way back down to the tunnel. I was angry, lost, starving, and I'd been abandoned to a fate that, if it wasn't worse than hell, was at least twice as stupid and 3 times as nonsensical. I was not in the best frame of mind, which I feel excuses the mistake. Normally, I take corners with a wide berth, because everyone knows that if you just dart around a corner sharply in a public place, chances are decent that you're going to walk right into someone. As I did, I slammed into someone, a woman, and fell to the ground. Without thinking, I reacted like any New Yorker would. Badly. Jesus, fuck, you stupid bitch. Watch where you're going. I realized my mistake even before she did. Her eyes grew quizzical and confused, and when she really noticed me, they bulged with horror. She leapt, floated quickly, back from me and let out something like a scream. A little more yowly than I was used to, but I got the point. Further down the tunnel, I saw alien 3-eyed heads turning towards us. I thought, subtly, about all those sharp, filthy teeth, and just like that, I was running. The subway train wasn't there, but there was a walkway along the tunnel for the repairmen, I assume. That's who'd use it where I'm from, anyway. I took it at full speed and just kept running until each breath felt like getting stabbed. I stopped, panting, and looked back. The tunnel had curved, so I couldn't see the light any longer, but nobody appeared to be following me. Going back, though, was not an option. I continued forward in the dark for a long time. Eventually, I came to a small opening in the wall and stopped there for a rest. Hunger, despair, and a full-speed, terrified run had all left me absolutely drained. I probably would have wept again, which seemed to be all I was capable of lately, but it just seemed like too much work. I sat against the wall, legs splayed out, and imagined I was beating that bastard stranger to death with a hammer. It was a relieving image. A rat was shuffling around nearby in the dark. Every so often, I would kick out a foot to scare it away, but after a time I didn't even bother with that. Rabies or any other disease it might be carrying would be a blessing compared to endless traveling through the subways of strange worlds, lost, destitute, and alone. When it crept near me again, I didn't shoo it off. Even when it reached and pressed against my leg, I couldn't bring myself to care. Not until a train passed by, and the lights of its car lit up the culvert I was in, and the thing that I had thought was a rat. It was rat-like, yes, but not as much as it was spider-like. If someone had bred the two of them together, the resulting abomination might have been almost as horrible as the thing nuzzling my leg. I shrieked, flung myself up from the door, and booted it like a soccer player would, right into the opposite wall. Its back made a sickening crunch, and I watched it twitch before the final car passed and darkness returned. And in the darkness, a terrible thought came to me. I wondered if it was edible. I didn't want to, and I gagged just imagining it, but I was hungry, and there was no guarantee that I'd be able to find food in this place or ever again. Rat spider was my only option. I held off as long as I could, but in the end, survival trumped squeamishness. I had my lighter, but nothing to light on fire. I picked meat off its carcass and cooked it a little by holding it over the flame, but it didn't help much. Nothing could have. Its meat was foul, more foul than anything you can imagine. I've been that desperate for food since, and eaten many other questionable things, but nothing has ever been as bad as that rat spider. In retrospect, that's when I became a stranger. Before, I'd struggled to reach that expressionless state the other had maintained. What I'd taken for calm was numbness. A sharp rock thrown into a river will, over time, have its edges rounded off by the water beating over it. And what I'd gone through had done the same. Tearing up and eating a monster in the dark below an alien world, the last of my edges smoothed. By the time I left the darkness and came back into the tunnel, I was as expressionless and empty as the one who led me here had ever been. That wasn't the worst of it though. The worst came later. The first time I got stuck. The stranger had mentioned it, but in the state I'd been in, I had hardly noticed. One night at the end of the line, I was asked to leave the train. The world was one of the closer to normal worlds. The people were almost human, as I recognized it. They were orange, sure, and had hunched backs, but other than that, they were practically normal. After the last worlds, where the people had been hideously overweight, six-breasted hermaphrodites with no noses, the orange guys were pretty much beautiful to me. I thought, at first, that the conductor was talking to someone else, but I was the only one in the car. And moreover, I'd understood him. The oranges certainly hadn't been speaking English all day, but nonetheless, I could understand what he was saying. When I stood, I began to realize why. I couldn't stand up straight. I was hunchbacked, and as I saw in my reflection against the window as I exited, orange. I pieced together the rest from there. Stuck meant that I was trapped in this world for some reason, and stuck looking like them as well, which would be handy if I wanted to take the opportunity to leave the subway station, which is possible most times, but requires a lot of care and is quite overwhelming. Alien worlds are a little revolting, I've found. You try to compare them to your own, but the differences are so vast that it just makes you sick. I left the subway anyway because it was clear I wasn't returning to the central hub, what I had taken to calling the infinite line of subway trains that night, or any other night, I soon found. Whatever had let me go unnoticed wasn't working any longer. I considered, briefly, staying, but this place wasn't home, and could never be. Even if they looked like me, their culture was bound to be different. That was the lesson I learned before. Even worlds where the people are absolutely indistinguishable from me are fraught with danger. I was once on a world where the people looked just like me. Well, actually they looked Brazilian, but that was more than close enough. And learned the hard way that the gesture to me that means hello meant something gravely insulting. Insulting enough that I'd been beaten half to death while a crowd looked on with approval. Besides, even if the place had a culture I could fake, I didn't want to stay. I wanted one of two things: to find my way home, or to find the stranger who'd set me on this path and beat the shit out of him. Nothing else would do. So I wanted to move on. I wasn't sure though if I could do to some poor sucker what had been done to me. Could I really force someone else to wander the eternal underground like me? It turned out I didn't have to. After a few months, one of them did notice me, yes, and begin to follow me for weeks. I very carefully made it seem like I hadn't seen him, just like the stranger had. But I was torn between the desire to warn him away and the desire to bring him to the end of the line so I could leave his dismal world already. The last night he followed me to the end of the line, just as I had once done. He hadn't managed to work up the nerve to sit right across from me though, and as soon as the train stopped at the terminus, he rushed off. I waited, hoping the conductor wouldn't see me and I could continue on, but to no avail. I left the car and the metro rushed off without me, and I cursed inside. As I walked around the corner towards the ticket booths, the young man who'd been following me attacked. He had a wicked curved knife and should have caught me by surprise, but I'd been traveling through hostile alien worlds for several years. My reflexes were sharp. We struggled viciously before I managed to wrestle the knife from him. I don't know how it got stuck in his neck. I don't think I wanted to kill him. I hadn't even been that angry. remembering my own building rage from so long before. Afterwards, as he lay there, bled out, I got pissed. I kicked him repeatedly, shouting, "You dick, you were supposed to follow me." I fled the scene of the crime, but not for long. I was there bright and early the next day to catch the first subway of the morning. And that night, when I rode into the end of the line, I was invisible to the conductor again. I guess you can either kill them or bring them with you if you want to return to the central hub. I was invisible again, but I was also orange and hunchback still. I stayed that way until the next time I became stuck. The next time I killed, that one went much faster. I didn't wait for her to follow me. Once I recognized her as a stranger, I recognized her as the next one, and I made my choice. I won't bring anyone else into this. It makes me wonder, though, about the stranger who inducted me. I wonder what he originally looked like and whether he knew he could have killed me. I wondered, too, about the others I saw back home and the rare few I came across since I left. Do they kill them or take them? And whichever one they choose, do they consider it a mercy? I can't bring myself to talk to them, to ask. We're damned either way, and the damned should suffer in solitude. I've killed 15 of them now, and I've gotten very good at it, but I've made a decision. I'm done killing innocents, at least. Before I returned to the central hub, I filled a backpack with as much paper as I could cram into it, and I wrote this story, over and over again, to be left in as many subway trains as I can. A couple thousand messages in bottles, cast into a sea of steel rails. This is a request and a warning. My request above was that you find my mother and tell her a lie. It's a white lie, don't worry. Tell my mother that I love her and that I'm trying to come home. It may give her some hope or a small measure of peace. I wish it were true, too, but here's the thing. I've been thinking of myself as like Odysseus, lost and adrift, looking to return to familiar shores. But I'm not lost at sea. I am lost in endless tunnels. The labyrinth. The difference is important because labyrinths are designed, built. Somebody or something made this impossible place, and they must be held accountable for what they've done to me. They cast me as Theseus, not Odysseus, but I won't play that part any longer either. The strange rules of this place have turned me from the human I began as into something else, then something else again. They have made me a monster, and so I will be the minotaur of this labyrinth, and if I can, I will tear it down around me and destroy those that built it. My warning is that you should be very wary in public places of silent, expressionless men and women. Keep your distance. They may kill you, or they may do worse. If you see them, run far and fast, and even more importantly, I warn you, no, I beg you, don't ride the train to the end of the line. Tinder, the app that allows you to swipe between people solely based on their appearance. Young people's heaven, right? What started off as some harmless fun escalated into a complete nightmare. I'd like to say at this point that I was never into dating apps. The whole concept was too weird. After watching episodes of MTV's Catfish, it confirmed my belief that talking to and meeting people online was a bad idea. However, after months of my friends using Tinder, I thought, fuck it, and decided to just download it. What could be the harm of it? My ex had cheated on me a few months prior, so after countless days of mourning the relationship and questioning everything possible that I could have done wrong, I decided to get back into the dating game. After a few days of using the app, I started to get into it. 50 matches and 6 proper conversations with people. To me, that was an achievement. Then I saw Hannah. Her profile was in a league of her own. Her pictures were beyond perfection. Her profile bio talking about her previous experience working in clubs and studying fashion at Northampton College. She was beautiful. I swiped yes, hoping it would match us. It was. I couldn't believe my luck. I wanted to keep it cool and not message her too quickly. After what seemed like a day, I said, "Hey." No reply. I started to panic. Fuck, I must have messed it up, I thought. I went through all the possible ways I could have fucked up with "hey." Should I have said hi, sup? Too late now. An hour passed. My phone vibrated. A Tinder notification from Hannah. "Hey." Success. And we began talking, discussing our hobbies, interests, previous relationships, the lot. After a few days of talking, I felt like I knew this girl inside out. Her parents had separated and she lived with her dad, taking on 2 jobs to support herself and him. She was a Virgo, as was I. It was great. It got to the point where I just felt right to ask any chance we could meet up at some point, get a drink or go for some coffee. Sure. My heart raced. I didn't think she would have said yes. We exchanged numbers and continued texting for a while, arranging to meet at a cocktail bar. 8 p.m. that night, I got on the bus and started walking towards the bar, my heart racing and palms beginning to sweat. What if she thought I was ugly? I kept thinking. I approached the entrance of the bar, arranging to meet her before we went in. This is where it got weird. She didn't text me much that day, just short sentences and long amounts of time between responses. I just assumed she was nervous. My phone vibrated. Hannah. "Babe, I just walked past you. You're so much more beautiful in person. I was too nervous to say hi. Please forgive me." I looked up from my phone and scanned the street area surrounding me. Just a few students and some elderly people coming home from the theater. "Where are you? I want to meet you," I texted. No response. I texted again. "You winding me up?" And still nothing. Maybe I got catfished. I mean, this girl couldn't possibly be intimidated by me. She was too attractive to be. My phone bleeped. "Please forgive me." Now, I was getting pretty creeped out. The combination of the darkness and a lack of people on the streets didn't help. I kept looking around to try and see her. Then, out of the corner of my eye, on the other side of the road and further down the street, a silhouette of someone standing, facing me. It was too dark to make out any features of the person. I just noticed a long black jacket with the hood. It couldn't have been her. I slowly reached into my pocket and sent her a blank text, my gaze still firmly on this figure. A phone lit up in its hand. Fuck this, I thought, and started power walking the other way. Who was it? Another text. "Why are you walking away? Am I not pretty?" That did it for me. I knew I'd been played. I felt like a complete idiot for falling for it. All I could think was getting back home and forgetting this ever happened. Hannah sent me another message. "I am a pretty girl. You will see." That made my skin crawl. I refused to respond to it. All I could picture was some strange woman texting me now. The aura of Hannah was instantly gone. The whole way home I felt like I was being followed. I don't know if it was just my paranoia, or if someone actually was. Either way, I had to get home. I lunged through the front door, locking it and checking all the windows and back doors were locked. I needed to get some sleep. It took me a while to drift off, my mind still replaying that figure standing there. 4 a.m. I awoke to the vibration of my phone, the immediate brightness blurring my vision. As my eyes adjusted to the screen, I looked at the notification. Hannah. My heart froze. I opened the message. It took me a second to process what I was looking at. It was just a picture message from Hannah. My blood went cold. On my screen was a picture of my bedroom from the door. Attached to the photo was Sleeping Beauty. I was facing away from the now opened bedroom door, knowing full well before I went to sleep I had closed it. The light from the hall had illuminated part of my room. I sat up in my bed, almost instantly, head now facing the door. Standing in the doorway in a dirty, ripped, knee-length pink dress was a man. A 5-foot, extremely elderly man wearing a blonde wig and what I could make out to be pink eyeshadow and red lipstick. His eyes were wide and fixated on me. The room was silent, and all I could hear was his heavy breathing. I looked in horror at this standing not 5 meters away from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, on my bed, in complete terror. The man took a step forward so he was in better vision. His salivating mouth formed an abnormally large, cartoon-like smile.
"Don't you think I'm pretty?"
he said in a hoarse voice, his mouth still grinning. Words tried forming in my head, but none of them would come out. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My heart was going into overload. Who are you? I could hear the fear in my voice. I couldn't think properly, my legs limp. The figure just stood there, eyes penetrating my soul. His smile grew larger, saliva dripping down his smudged lipstick.
"I'm Hannah, and I'm a pretty girl."
For some reason, people think that lockdowns aren't a serious thing. They are. They can be the most terrifying experience of your life, and if you're unlucky, the last experience. Lockdown drills have this strange aura around them. I'm sure it's partly due to the silly lockdown drills everyone goes through in their time in public school. Everyone in your class huddled up in a corner with the lights off and door locked, just waiting for the principal to announce the end of the drill, only to return to the monotony of regular school life. I went through countless lockdown drills, and despite the school's attempt to prepare me for the real thing, I was anything but when the day of a real lockdown came. I come from a relatively small town in Arkansas. It isn't a small enough town that everybody knows each other, but it is still pretty small nonetheless. The school is right in front of a forest that goes out for miles. If you go through this forest in the right direction, you'll eventually find a prison. There has always been talk of a prisoner escaping and coming to the school, but it was never serious. I'm not sure exactly how far the prison is, but the teachers always did a good job of reassuring us that it's way too far to walk to the school from. The day the lockdown happened was very groggy and dark. I remember that I missed the bus that morning, and I had to catch a ride with my friend Andrew. Him and I were best friends, and had been from a very young age. I can still remember the way he laughed at my jokes. Anyway, when we got to the school, it was just a normal day for the first 2 periods. I had geography and algebra, which totally sucked. The cool thing about my schedule was that Andrew was in most of my classes with me, so even the boring classes were somewhat bearable. When the bell to math class began to ring, I was a little startled, but my surprise quickly turned to excitement because Andrew and I had gym class next. We always enjoyed ourselves there. It was the only period in school where I actually felt like I did something. Most of the time we played some version of dodgeball or flag football when the weather permitted. When we got to gym, Andrew realized he'd forgotten his shorts in his normal locker, which was on the other side of the school. Luckily for him, there weren't any shorts in the lost and found pile, which the gym teacher normally made us wear if we forgot our shorts. Andrew asked to get his shorts and the teacher agreed. He also gave me permission to go with him as he knew we were best friends. There was something about walking in those halls without all the usual traffic that felt so cool. Have you ever had that feeling? It just feels more, open. Well, the mesmerizing feeling of being in the empty halls would wear off soon enough. When we got to Andrew's locker, I decided to use the bathroom, which was only a few steps away. The second I unleashed the floodgates, the principal, in a worried and shaky voice, announced over the intercom that we were going into a lockdown. I immediately freaked out and started thinking about where the nearest classroom was. In only a few seconds, I mentally planned out what I was going to do once I finished. I was going to run out of the bathroom, grab Andrew, and rush to the faculty room, which was just around the corner. Once I was done, I made my way out of the bathroom and heard something that sounded out of place. It almost sounded like a scream, but I couldn't be sure due to the sound of the self-flushing urinal. I could feel myself getting more and more anxious as the moments passed. My terror came to a climax when I turned the corner to see that Andrew was gone. His locker was left open and his shorts were lying on the floor where he'd been standing. I glanced in both directions, but he was nowhere to be found. Neither was anyone else, for that matter. I tried calming myself down and just began to think that Andrew must have just left to get to safety. I ran to the faculty lounge and knocked on the door. They let me in, and to my surprise, Andrew wasn't there. From there, I figured he went in the other direction, which didn't really make any sense. There were just lockers upon lockers for a while, but I assumed he just made a bad judgment call. As I sat in the carpeted lounge area with a few teachers and one other student who looked to be scared out of her mind, I started to think more and more about Andrew. How the hell could he just leave me like that? I'm his best friend, and he just left with no consideration for me at all. I started to think. Actions speak louder than words. The more I thought about it, the more the idea of Andrew being a bad friend grew on me. Maybe he was always like this and I just didn't notice because we were never in a serious situation. The one time I needed him to be there for me, he wasn't there. Before the end of the lockdown, I decided that I wasn't going to be Andrew's friend anymore. It was a really long time before the lockdown actually ended. Probably an hour or two at least. When it did, we were sent home early. Sitting on the uncomfortable bus seat and staring out the window, I saw police officers there, and I wondered if anyone was hurt. The next day, I was called into the principal's office and they asked me a whole bunch of questions about the day prior. I told them how I was in the bathroom and when I got out, Andrew was gone. I knew something was up when my principal gave me an empathic look. I'll never forget the words that came out of her mouth. "I'm sorry to say, but your friend, Andrew, is missing. Nobody has seen him since the lockdown." I had no idea what to say. I just sat there in silence, stunned for a while. Finally, they asked if I wanted to talk to somebody, and I told them no. The rest of the day was a blur. The only other thing I remember from that day was the guilt washing over me. Here I was, blaming Andrew for not being there for me, when it was really I who was not there for him. I later learned that they believed the man who broke into the school, an escaped prisoner, kidnapped Andrew. They weren't able to find him. Years later, there haven't been any leads, and nobody knows what the hell to do. Most people have accepted that Andrew is probably dead. But that isn't even the worst part. The worst part is knowing that the escaped convict who kidnapped him was serving a prison sentence for human trafficking.